It's the most powerful position in the world, the job that's launched wars, ended them, dismantled empires, dropped bombs, and signed peace treaties on aircraft carriers. But for all the decisions, the fame, the scandals, and the speeches, there's one thing every U.S. president has in common. They all die. Some quietly, some spectacularly, some early, some long after they were forgotten, some maybe a little too poetically. This is not a story about how they lived. It's a story about how they left. Sometimes symbolic, sometimes suspicious, sometimes just plain sad ways that power finally shuts down. Welcome to Every President's Death. Before we begin the countdown, hit subscribe if you're into history without the sugarcoating. This is Every President's Death, told plainly, painfully, and without the usual eulogies. Let's get started. George Washington, the man who wouldn't be king, died because he got wet. On December 12th, 1799, George Washington went out for a horseback ride around Mount Vernon in freezing rain. He came home soaked and hoarse. The next day, he woke up with a sore throat and trouble speaking, but he didn't cancel his appointments. Washington wasn't the kind of man who canceled anything. By the next night, he was in respiratory distress. His throat was closing. He couldn't swallow. And then the medical team arrived. In 1799, medicine involved guesses, knives, and a strong stomach. Washington was treated with the best techniques available at the time, which included bloodletting. About 40% of his total blood volume was drained. Blistering agents applied to his throat and legs. Mercury-based laxatives. A vinegar gargle. Then they tried to slice open his throat to get air in. What we'd now call an emergency tracheotomy, except they used a pocket knife and didn't really know how. He died late in the evening of December 14th. His last words were reportedly, "'Tis well, always the stoic, always composed, even while suffocating." Modern doctors generally agree he died of acute epiglottitis, a rapid onset throat infection that today would be treated with antibiotics and oxygen. In other words, something that's treatable at any emergency room in America, as long as the staff doesn't drain half your blood and rub mustard on your feet first. The irony? Washington had ordered in his will that he not be buried for 3 days, just in case he wasn't fully dead. It was a common fear at the time, being buried alive. So his body was left alone, packed in ice, and periodically checked for signs of life. He didn't move, but it's worth noting that the founding father of the country, a man who walked away from absolute power, died powerless, surrounded by experts, and none of them could save him. He was the first president, the only one unanimously elected, and when he died, the entire nation mourned. But they didn't have long to wait before another death came along. Not another president, not yet, but the groundwork was being laid. Fast forward a few decades, and the 4th of July becomes a national symbol. Freedom, patriotism, fireworks, a good day to be an American. And as it turns out, a very strange day for two of the founding presidents to die. On the exact same day, 50 years to the day after the Declaration of Independence was signed, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, men who once fought together, then turned rivals, both died hours apart, one not knowing the other had already gone. Coincidence? Sure. But history is full of those, so let's move on to death number 2 and 3. John Adams. John Adams lived long enough to become what most revolutionaries don't, an old man. By the time he died, the revolution he helped ignite had already become an institution. The country had doubled in size. There were steamships in the harbors, canals across the land, and factory whistles replacing musket fire. Adams, once a hot-headed Boston lawyer who defended British soldiers in court and later wrote the Massachusetts Constitution, was now mostly confined to his study in Quincy, Massachusetts, reading, writing letters, occasionally muttering about Thomas Jefferson. He was 90. A remarkable age, especially for a man who had spent the prime of his life surrounded by war, disease, and colonial dentistry. He was, for a while, the oldest living former president and the last surviving signer of the Declaration of Independence. At least that's what he thought. On July 4th, 1826, exactly 50 years to the day after the signing of that declaration, John Adams lay dying in his home. His health had been declining for months. That morning, he slipped in and out of consciousness. He reportedly whispered fragments of prayer, murmured about liberty, and, most famously, uttered what would become his last words. Thomas Jefferson survives. Except he didn't. Jefferson had died earlier that same day, hours before Adams, hundreds of miles away in Virginia. Jefferson had succumbed to a long illness, surrounded by family, after dictating a final, heavily revised note for the 4th of July. Adams never knew. The symbolism was irresistible. Two of the most pivotal figures in American independence, co-authors, political enemies, and late-life pen pals, dying on the same date, the semi-centennial of the nation's birth. The newspapers called it Providence. Historians called it poetic. Cynics called it clean timing. But it's the misunderstanding, the belief that Jefferson lived on, that lingers. Adams died thinking his old rival had outlasted him, that the Enlightenment dream they'd both championed, then bickered over, would continue without him. Maybe that's what he wanted, or maybe he just couldn't imagine the American experiment without Jefferson's pen on the page. Cause of death? Old age, most say. Probably congestive heart failure or stroke. No mystery there. The real story is how long he kept dying. His family watched him for hours. He lingered, faded, came back a little, and then slipped away for good. In 1826, there were no ventilators, no monitors, just a dying man and a room full of people wondering if the next breath would be the last. They lit candles, they prayed, they watched. And then it was done. Adams died in his home, in his own bed, in the house he'd built on the hill. There were no doctors bleeding him, no experimental procedures, just the quiet unraveling of a body that had outlived its time. He was the second president of the United States, the first to lose re-election, the first to live to see his son become president, and the first president to die on the 4th of July. But not the only one. Because while Adams was fading in Quincy, Jefferson was already dead in Virginia, and if Adams was the voice of American law, Jefferson was the architect of American myth, and when Jefferson died, he did it with just as much symbolism, just as much timing, and just as much mystery. Thomas Jefferson. By the summer of 1826, Thomas Jefferson was more idea than man. He had written the words that launched a revolution. All men are created equal, while owning hundreds of people and using their forced labor to build his dream estate at Monticello. He'd expanded the country through the Louisiana Purchase, founded the University of Virginia, and curated a personal library so vast it had once replaced the one burned by the British in the War of 1812. He lived long enough to watch his ideals bend under the weight of the country that claimed them. But still, when he fell ill that final summer, Jefferson clung to a date. He wanted to die on the 4th of July. By mid-June, Jefferson was visibly deteriorating. Chronic infections, internal bleeding, and a weakening heart left him barely able to speak. His doctors offered opium. He took none. Not yet. He was waiting. On July 3rd, he slipped into and out of consciousness. His family gathered. Outside, preparations were underway across Virginia for the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. The fireworks were for him. He knew it. He woke long enough to ask one question over and over again. Is it the 4th? Around noon on July 4th, 1826, Thomas Jefferson died. He was 83. His final words are disputed. Some say they were about God. Others say they were just numbers and breath. Whatever they were, they landed at exactly the time he wanted them to. Poetic, clean, almost too perfect. He died unaware that John Adams, his old rival and reluctant pen pal, was also dying at that same moment, hundreds of miles away. And when the news broke that both men had passed within hours of each other, exactly 50 years to the day after they'd signed the nation into being, it didn't feel like a coincidence. It felt scripted. The press called it divine timing, providence, fate. But even fate has a strange sense of humor, because the real ending of this chapter didn't come with Jefferson or Adams. It came 5 years later when yet another founding father, another former president, also died on July 4th. James Monroe, the quiet diplomat behind the Monroe Doctrine, and the last of the so-called Virginia dynasty, would become the third president to die on Independence Day, not by plan, not by declaration, but by some bizarre gravitational pull of that date. 3 presidents, 3 founding figures, all dead on the same day. So let's look at Monroe, the man who outlived his mentors, inherited their contradictions, and followed them one last time. straight to the grave. James Monroe. By 1831, James Monroe was a living echo of a revolution that had already passed into myth. He was the 5th president of the United States, the final member of the so-called Virginia dynasty of presidents, and the 3rd president in a row to die on July 4th. The date was beginning to get suspicious. It had been exactly 5 years since John Adams and Thomas Jefferson both died, independently but symbolically, on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. That coincidence had stunned the country. Poets and preachers called it providence. Skeptics called it dramatic timing. Either way, the narrative was locked in. So when James Monroe died on July 4th, 1831, the storyline wrote itself. 3 of the first 5 presidents, all dead on Independence Day, founding figures, national symbols, collapsing on the same date the country lit its sky on fire in their honor. But Monroe hadn't planned it that way. By the time of his death, he was a widower, drowning in debt, and living with his daughter in New York City, a far cry from the southern estates of Washington or Jefferson. His health had been failing for months. His lungs were deteriorating. His heart was weak. Modern guesses point to tuberculosis or heart failure, possibly both. He had been coughing blood, fatigued, and in and out of consciousness in his final days. There were no grand speeches, no poetic final phrases, just a man slipping away as the country fired cannons and waved flags outside his window. And despite the headlines that followed, another president dies on the 4th. Monroe's death didn't cause a national reckoning. It didn't launch a movement or swell into mythology. It was quieter than that. Monroe had been out of office for nearly a decade. The country was changing. Jackson was in power now. And Monroe, like the ideals of his generation, was becoming background noise. That's not to say he didn't leave a mark. Monroe's presidency had been a calm stretch between storms. No major wars, no great scandals. His so-called era of good feelings was politically soft around the edges, just the way he liked it. But his legacy came down to one line: the Monroe Doctrine, a warning shot to Europe, declaring the Western Hemisphere off limits to colonial expansion. It was bold, assertive, imperial in a folksy kind of way, and it became one of the pillars of American foreign policy, twisted, reinterpreted, and rebranded for every century that followed. And yet, that wasn't the man who died in 1831. That man was just another former president, worn thin, breathing shallow, another founding father whose ideals would outlive his body, another name to carve in stone, and another president to die on the 4th of July. Not the last, but the last one to make it look unplanned. Of course, Monroe wasn't the final founding father. One more remained, quieter, shorter, sharper, the man behind the Bill of Rights, the architect of the Constitution, the president who once told Congress that war should be a last resort before starting one anyway. James Madison didn't die on July 4th, but he almost did. And his reason for not dying that day was almost comically polite. James Madison. By the time James Madison died, almost no one was left who remembered the revolution firsthand. He was the last of the founding presidents, the final architect still breathing. And unlike 3 of his fellow presidents, Jefferson, Adams, and Monroe, he did not die on the 4th of July, but by some accounts, he could have. Madison's death came on June 28, 1836, less than a week before Independence Day. The story goes that doctors told him he might survive a few more days, and his family reportedly encouraged him to hold on until July 4th. After all, it would have made the story neater. 4 founding fathers, 4 presidents, 1 date, symmetry. But Madison, ever the institutionalist, refused to upstage the holiday. Whether that anecdote is true or retrofitted by a 19th century biographer is anyone's guess. But it fits the man. Madison was never drawn to spectacle. He worked in the shadows, writing drafts, tweaking frameworks, inserting clauses that would later become constitutional canon. If Washington was the sword and Jefferson the pen, Madison was the editor. When he finally died at the age of 85, it wasn't dramatic. His health had been in steady decline for years. He suffered from rheumatism, chronic digestive problems, and what we now might call heart failure. His body was giving out slowly, carefully, in long measured declines, just like the governments he spent his life designing. He died at his Montpelier estate in Virginia. No pomp, no fireworks, just a man in bed, taking his last breath on a hot summer morning, the same way many of the people he had once represented died, quietly, without headlines. It's easy to forget that this frail, bookish man had helped shape nearly every political document in early American life. He had been the principal writer of the Constitution. He helped spearhead the Federalist Papers. He fought to include the Bill of Rights. And as president, he led the country, reluctantly, through the War of 1812, even as the White House itself burned to the ground. He also owned more than 100 enslaved people and freed none of them in his lifetime. Madison's mind never dulled, even as his body did. He spent his final years writing letters, obsessively revisiting the early years of the Republic, correcting what others remembered incorrectly, defending his legacy before it could be redefined without him. And in the end, he declined to die on the 4th of July. Maybe out of modesty. Maybe because his body simply couldn't hold on another 6 days. Or maybe because he understood better than most that not every story needs a perfect ending. His funeral was modest. Fewer than 100 people came. His wife Dolly, who would outlive him by 13 years, would eventually sell many of his papers just to survive. And so passed the last founding president, William Henry Harrison. There's a good chance William Henry Harrison would have lived longer if he'd just kept his mouth shut. On March 4th, 1841, Harrison stepped up to deliver his inaugural address. He was 68 years old, the oldest president ever elected at the time. The country was in a financial panic. His campaign had been all log cabins and hard cider populism, but behind the branding was a man determined to prove he was still vigorous, still sharp, still ready to lead. So he did what old men trying to prove something often do. He overcompensated. He gave a 2-hour-long speech, outdoors, in freezing rain, without a coat, without gloves, without a hat. He spoke for 8,445 words, quoting Cicero, referencing ancient Rome, and spending a lot of time making sure everyone knew he wasn't going to be controlled by party elites, especially not Henry Clay, the Whig Party's big personality at the time. He then attended 3 inaugural balls, shook hundreds of hands, and went back to the White House like a man who hadn't just exposed his elderly lungs to a full day of Washington's March weather. 3 weeks later, he was sick. By day 22, he had a persistent cough and high fever. His doctors thought it was a simple cold. Then it became pneumonia. Then it became something worse. They treated him with leeches and castor oil and opium and brandy and hot pepper plasters. Basically, the usual 19th century medical buffet. Half torture, half guesswork. By day 31, he was dead. The first president to die in office. The shortest serving president in American history. Barely enough time to pick curtains. Harrison's death launched a constitutional crisis. The idea of presidential succession wasn't clearly laid out at the time. The Constitution said the vice president would assume the powers and duties of the presidency, but did that mean he became president? Or just acted like one? Enter John Tyler, Harrison's vice president, who made an executive decision. He wasn't just acting as president. He was president now. He even had his mail redirected. Congress balked. But Tyler held his ground, set the precedent, and never looked back. As for Harrison, he left behind a country confused, a party fractured, and a cautionary tale that still gets told in civics class. Cause of death? Technically pneumonia, but modern historians suspect it might have been enteric fever, possibly caused by contaminated water from a nearby sewage site. The White House water supply at the time? Less than sanitary. So maybe it wasn't the rain-soaked speech that killed him. Maybe it was the plumbing, or the doctors, or the symbolism of a man stepping into the presidency and immediately stepping out of history. What's certain is this: Harrison holds a record no one wants. 31 days, 0 bills signed, and 1 very expensive funeral. Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson didn't die quietly. He never did anything quietly. When he finally succumbed in June of 1845, it wasn't to a single cause. It was to all of them. A full-body mutiny, decades in the making, heart failure, dropsy, chronic infections, intestinal bleeding, possibly even tuberculosis. He had been held together by stubbornness and spite for years. And now both were running out. Jackson had been the 7th president of the United States, But more importantly, he was the first one to come in swinging, the first president born into poverty, the first to ride a populist wave into office, and the first who understood politics not as a system, but as a fight, with clear winners and permanent enemies. He shot people, he got shot, he carried bullets in his body for over 40 years. In one duel, he let a man fire at him first, took the hit to the chest, and then calmly raised his own pistol and shot the man dead. He bled through his coat and finished breakfast. By the time Jackson entered the White House, he was already a battlefield of scars. And by the time he left, the list of people who wanted him dead had grown considerably longer. There were the Native American nations he forcibly relocated, the banks he destroyed, the political opponents he humiliated. He beat a would-be assassin nearly to death with his cane outside the Capitol. The man's gun had misfired, twice. Jackson saw that as divine endorsement and moved fast. But none of that protected him from what came later. After leaving office, Jackson retired to his plantation, the Hermitage, outside Nashville. His health steadily declined. He was suffering from dropsy, what we now call edema, as his organs began to fail. His legs swelled grotesquely. His stomach bled. His breathing was labored. He had persistent infections, toothaches, a failing heart, and almost no appetite. He spent his final days writing letters, dictating instructions, and warning his country about a sectionalism, the North-South divide he could see coming. He still received visitors, he still barked opinions, but the man who once redefined the presidency now couldn't walk up the stairs in his own home. He died on June 8, 1845, at the age of 78, surrounded by family and slaves. The contradictions didn't die with him. He left behind a political philosophy called Jacksonian democracy, and a country unsure whether to revere him or regret him. Cause of death: congestive heart failure with a side of chronic everything. They buried him on his estate under a simple tombstone. His epitaph didn't mention the presidency, just that he was General Andrew Jackson, because to him that title mattered more. Jackson's death marked the end of an era of brawling populism, but the next presidential death wasn't a general or a populist or even someone particularly passionate about politics. It was a man born into legacy, a scholar, a diplomat, and the only president, before or since, to die literally on the job: John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams wasn't supposed to be here. Not here, as in alive at age 80 in the mid-19th century, though that alone was impressive, but here as in back in Washington, on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives, decades after serving as the 6th President of the United States. He had been president, he'd done his time, lost his re-election. Most men in his position would have retired to a quiet estate, written some memoirs, and faded into the polite background of political memory. But John Quincy Adams wasn't most men. After leaving the presidency, he ran for Congress and won. Then he ran again, and again, and again. He served as a representative from Massachusetts for 17 years, fighting harder from the backbenches than he ever could from the White House. They called him the Old Man Eloquent, and if the name sounds like a compliment, it wasn't always meant to be one. Adams was brilliant and infuriating. He didn't care for political parties, wasn't particularly friendly, and had a habit of being right in a way that made everyone uncomfortable. He spent most of his post-presidency battling against slavery, not through fiery speeches, but through procedural warfare. He fought the infamous gag rule in Congress, which banned any discussion of anti-slavery petitions. For years, he challenged it every single session. He was relentless, annoying even, but effective. And then one day in 1848, he stood up in the House to speak and collapsed. It was February 21st. The chamber fell silent. At first, they thought he'd fainted. Then came the realization he'd suffered a stroke. He was carried to the speaker's room, an office just off the House floor, and laid on a couch. He never got up again. He lingered for 2 days, slipping in and out of consciousness, surrounded by stunned colleagues who weren't sure whether to treat it as a tragedy or a lesson in overcommitment. One of his final recorded phrases was this: "This is the end of Earth. I am content." On February 23rd, 1848, John Quincy Adams died in the Capitol, not just in the building, but in the heart of it. a former president who refused to retire, refused to fade, and ultimately died mid-debate, exactly the way he'd lived. They draped the Capitol in black. They buried him with honors. Not in some quiet plot, but alongside his father, John Adams, in Quincy, Massachusetts. Father and son, both presidents, both outliers. His cause of death was a cerebral hemorrhage, a stroke, the body saying enough even when the mind still had rebuttals prepared, and so ended the Adams line in presidential history, two men who helped build the republic and watched it grow far beyond their comfort zone. But the next death would be quicker, stranger, and frankly harder to explain, because up next is James K. Polk, the president who got everything he wanted and then died almost immediately after. James K. Polk. James K. Polk was the kind of man who set a goal, met it, and then collapsed. Literally. When he took office in 1845, Polk came with a to-do list. It had 4 items: reestablish the independent treasury, reduce tariffs, settle the Oregon boundary dispute, acquire California and the American Southwest. And over the course of 4 years, he checked off every single box. By the time Polk left office in March of 1849, the United States had grown by over 1 million square miles. He had fought a war with Mexico, negotiated with Britain, restructured the economy, and redrawn the map of North America. He delivered exactly what he promised, and then he died. 3 months after leaving office, Polk was dead, the shortest post-presidency in American history. He was 53. What killed him? Officially, cholera, likely contracted during his trip back to Tennessee. Unofficially, terminal overachievement. Polk was known for being obsessive. He was a micromanager, a workaholic, a man who didn't delegate so much as tolerate the people around him. He rarely took breaks. He rarely smiled. He was in the White House to work, not to enjoy it, and work he did. His health had been declining steadily throughout his term. He suffered from exhaustion, chronic digestive problems, and possibly gallbladder issues. He'd never been particularly robust, but the pressures of office stripped him down further. By the end, he looked 20 years older than when he'd started. When he left Washington, he and his wife Sarah traveled south, stopping in New Orleans, where cholera had recently broken out. Within weeks, he was feverish, vomiting, and slipping into dehydration. It was fast, violent, and not uncommon in that era. He died on June 15th, 1849. Just 103 days after leaving the presidency. He'd been planning to retire, maybe write, maybe reflect. Instead, he left behind a presidency defined by speed, ambition, and territorial conquest. And a death that came before the ink on his legacy had even dried. There was no grand farewell tour, no long retirement letters, just 4 years of breakneck governing, and then silence. He was buried first in a city cemetery, then later reinterred at his home in Nashville, where his epitaph reads, "He has filled the measure of his country's glory." Maybe, but he also filled his own grave faster than any president before or since. James K. Polk expanded the United States by 1/3, but his heart, and maybe his stomach, couldn't handle the weight of it. The next president to die wouldn't be in a rush. In fact, he'd barely had time to unpack. Because Zachary Taylor was still adjusting to life in the White House when he ate something that disagreed with him. Bad water, bad cherries, bad timing, whatever it was, he was dead in 16 months. If you're still watching, you probably like your history with a pulse. Hit like or subscribe. It keeps this series breathing. Now let's talk about the man who barely unpacked his bags before dying in office. Zachary Taylor didn't want to be president. That wasn't modesty, it was logistical. He had never voted in a presidential election, wasn't aligned with a political party until they drafted him, and didn't even know he'd been nominated until someone mailed him a newspaper clipping. This was 1848. The Whigs were desperate for a war hero. Taylor had won the Mexican-American War. That was enough. But he wasn't made for politics. He was a soldier, a battlefield guy, gruff, blunt, and largely uninterested in the machinery of Washington. When he arrived at the White House in March of 1849, he brought his boots, his stubbornness, and very little interest in changing clothes or changing minds. 16 months later, he was dead. On July 4th, 1850, President Taylor attended a long, sweltering Independence Day celebration at the Washington Monument site. He sat in the sun for hours. The temperature was brutal. The shade was hypothetical. Afterward, he returned to the White House and did what any overheating exhausted 65-year-old might do. He reached for a snack. According to historical reports, Taylor consumed a large quantity of raw cherries, followed by iced milk and cold water. Not exactly a balanced diet, even by 19th century standards. Within hours, he began suffering from severe stomach cramps, vomiting, and diarrhea. Doctors were summoned. They applied leeches, bled him, administered opium and quinine, blistered his skin, and tried to balance his humors. Nothing worked. 5 days later, on July 9th, 1850, Zachary Taylor was dead. Official cause of death: acute gastroenteritis, likely from contaminated food or drink. But not everyone believed that. In the decades after his death, conspiracy theories began to circulate. Some believed Taylor had been poisoned, possibly by Southern pro-slavery factions who feared his moderate stance on expanding slavery into the new Western territories. Taylor, though a slave owner himself, had opposed the extension of slavery into the lands gained from the Mexican War. That made him dangerous to powerful Southern interests. And so, in 1991, yes, 1991, Taylor's body was exhumed by forensic scientists. They ran toxicology tests on hair and bone samples, looking for traces of arsenic. The results? Negative. No evidence of poisoning. Just a very dead president and a country still wondering how a decorated general survived multiple wars, only to be undone by fruit and dairy. In death, Taylor left behind a constitutional vacuum. Vice President Millard Fillmore stepped in, a man Taylor had reportedly barely spoken to. The Whig Party, already fractured, began to collapse, and the nation inched closer to the sectional crisis that would erupt into civil war a decade later. Taylor, the reluctant president, was buried in Louisville, Kentucky. He never wanted the job. He barely had time to understand it. But his death set in motion a political realignment that would shake the Union. One president dies from cold milk and cherries. The next one dies quietly, almost politely, in a hotel room, after switching sides. John Tyler didn't just finish Taylor's term, he finished it as a man the country never fully accepted, and who, in the end, didn't fully accept the country either. John Tyler died a man without a country, not metaphorically, literally. When he took his final breath in 1862, during the height of the Civil War, the government he once led didn't acknowledge his death. There was no national mourning, no flag at half-staff, no ceremony. He had once been President of the United States. He died a citizen of the Confederate States of America. Tyler's presidency began in constitutional confusion. He was vice president when Zachary Taylor died in office, the first time a president had ever done that. The Constitution said the VP should assume the powers and duties of the office, but it wasn't clear whether that meant acting as president or becoming president. Tyler didn't wait for clarification. He moved into the White House, took the oath, insisted on being called president. Congress balked, but Tyler didn't care. He set the precedent, and ever since, it's been followed. Still, his tenure was rocky. He was a former Democrat pretending to be a Whig, and the Whigs caught on quickly. He vetoed key parts of their legislative agenda. They expelled him from the party. His own cabinet resigned. One newspaper referred to him as His Accidency. By the time he left office in 1845, he was politically homeless. So he went home to his Virginia plantation and watched the nation crack open. As the secession crisis erupted, Tyler's loyalties leaned south. He tried half-heartedly to broker peace as a delegate to the Washington Peace Conference in 1861. But when that failed and the Confederacy declared independence, Tyler signed on, fully, enthusiastically. He was elected to the Confederate House of Representatives and accepted the seat. The United States called it treason. Tyler called it Virginia. His health had been deteriorating for years. He suffered from strokes, dizziness, chronic intestinal problems. On January 18th, 1862, at the age of 71, John Tyler collapsed in the middle of a conversation with his wife. He died the next day. The cause of death was most likely a stroke brought on by chronic cardiovascular disease. But in the eyes of the federal government, the real cause was betrayal. President Lincoln did not issue a public statement. The U.S. flag was not lowered. Congress did not eulogize him. His death was reported in northern newspapers as briefly as possible. In Richmond, Virginia, capital of the Confederacy, he received a full state funeral. draped in Confederate flags, buried as a Southern patriot. He remains the only U.S. president to be buried under a foreign flag. There's a strange finality in Tyler's story. He was born in the shadow of the Revolution, rose through a fragile union, and chose to die in rebellion against the very country he once led. History has never quite known what to do with him. Neither side truly claimed him. Neither side fully mourned him. And maybe that's fitting, because the next president to die was also caught in a strange national pause. A man who outlived his relevance and died during a lull in American memory. Martin Van Buren, the little magician, the skilled operator, the architect of political machines, forgotten almost as soon as he was gone. Martin Van Buren. By the time Martin Van Buren died in 1862, hardly anyone noticed. The Civil War was in full swing. Thousands of Americans were dying every week. The Union was fracturing, the Confederacy was marching, and Van Buren, once the most skilled political operator in the country, passed away in the background noise of national collapse. And maybe that's the most Van Buren thing to ever happen. He had been the 8th president of the United States, and the first one born after the American Revolution. A political tactician more than a visionary, Van Buren didn't invent the system. He refined it. He helped create the modern Democratic Party, engineered campaign machines, and mastered the art of patronage. His nickname was the Little Magician, and it wasn't a compliment. It was a warning. His presidency, though, was cursed with bad timing. Van Buren entered office in 1837, just in time for the Panic of 1837. A brutal economic depression. Banks failed. Unemployment soared. And though many of the policies that triggered the crisis were set in motion before he arrived, the blame landed squarely on his neatly tailored shoulders. He lost re-election in a landslide. After that, Van Buren never quite left the political stage, but he never really commanded it again either. He tried for a comeback, ran in 1848 as the candidate for the Free Soil Party, a new coalition opposed to the expansion of slavery. He didn't win a single state, but he took just enough votes from the Democrats to help elect Zachary Taylor, a Whig. Even in defeat, Van Buren remained a disruptor, but then came the slow fade. By the 1850s, he was retired on his estate in Kinderhook, New York, writing, reading, outliving his colleagues, and watching the country unravel in ways that no coalition could fix. He had once believed that party loyalty could hold the country together, but slavery, expansion, and irreconcilable ambition were stronger than his machines. His health declined gradually: asthma, heart failure, a weakened immune system, and on July the 24th, 1862, at the age of 79, Martin Van Buren died quietly at home. There were no dramatic speeches, no tragic irony, no public spectacle, just an old man dying during a war he had tried and failed to prevent. Buried in Kinderhook, mourned mostly by footnotes. Official cause of death, bronchial asthma and heart failure, but unofficially, he died of being forgotten in real time. There's something fitting about that. Van Buren was never a firebrand, never a martyr. He was the backstage guy, the fixer, the man who pulled the strings and smiled when no one noticed his hands on them. And in the end, history returned the favor. But America wouldn't be quiet for long. The next president to die wouldn't pass away in the shadows. He would die at the peak of national crisis, in a crowded theater, by a bullet. Abraham Lincoln didn't just die in office. He died in the middle of the nation's defining tragedy, and the country would never recover from the sound of that gunshot. Abraham Lincoln didn't die in bed. He died on stage. Not literally, he was sitting in a balcony. But the setting, the audience, the timing, it was theatrical, and the message was meant for everyone. It was April 14th, 1865, just 5 days after General Robert E. Lee had surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The war was over, or at least that's what people were trying to believe. Lincoln had been re-elected. The Union had survived. Reconstruction was next, though no one could agree on what that meant. That night, Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., Our American Cousin, a light British comedy. He brought his wife. The mood was hopeful, if fragile. Then came John Wilkes Booth, actor, Confederate sympathizer, familiar face backstage. At 10:15 p.m., Booth entered the president's box and shot Lincoln in the back of the head at close range with a .44 caliber Derringer pistol. Then he leapt onto the stage, shouting "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants, and broke his leg on impact. Still, he escaped. Lincoln, unconscious, was carried across the street to a boarding house. His breathing slowed, his color faded, the cabinet gathered. He never woke up. At 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln was pronounced dead. Cause of death: gunshot wound to the head. Effect of death: a nation suddenly unled, unready, and undone. The country lost its moral center mid-sentence. Mobs wept in the streets. His body was embalmed and taken by train from Washington to Springfield, Illinois, in a 1,600-mile funeral procession. It took 2 weeks. Millions lined the tracks. His coffin was displayed in cities along the route. It became a moving shrine, a mobile reckoning. Lincoln was the first U.S. president to be assassinated. The word entered American politics that week and never left. The implications? Immediate and devastating. His vision of a gentle reconstruction died with him. What followed was a vacuum, then a power struggle, and then chaos. The South would resist. The North would fracture. The war would end, but the peace would be another battle entirely. And standing quietly behind all of this, watching from Pennsylvania, was the man Lincoln had replaced, James Buchanan. Buchanan had left office in 1861, disgraced, despised, and politically radioactive. His presidency ended as Lincoln's began, and as the Civil War erupted, Buchanan did something remarkable. He said almost nothing, but when Lincoln died and the nation unraveled in mourning, Buchanan's silence ended. He began to defend himself. Because deep down, maybe he understood, history was about to blame him for everything that came before that bullet. James Buchanan. If Abraham Lincoln was the martyr, James Buchanan was the prequel no one wanted to rewatch. He was the 15th president of the United States, the last before the Civil War, and possibly the only man in American history whose central presidential strategy was to do nothing and hope the problem went away. That didn't work. By the time Buchanan died in 1868, the country had been torn apart, stitched together, and left scarred beyond recognition. And while he hadn't lived long enough to see how Reconstruction would collapse, he did live long enough to hear exactly what people thought of his role in getting the country to war in the first place. He didn't take it well. Buchanan left office in March 1861, as the country was actively disintegrating. 7 southern states had already seceded. Fort Sumter was under threat. His solution? Blame Congress. Blame the North. Blame the South. Blame the Constitution. Blame anyone, really, as long as it wasn't James Buchanan. He believed the federal government didn't have the right to stop secession. His logic was airtight in his mind and disastrous in practice. When Lincoln took office and war broke out within weeks, Buchanan's legacy was sealed. The man who watched the house burn and politely asked someone else to call for help. After the war, Buchanan retreated to his estate in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. His reputation? In ruins. He was widely considered one of the worst presidents in U.S. history. That stung badly. So, naturally, Buchanan decided to write a book, a long, defensive, point-by-point rebuttal to the entire nation. Published in 1866, Mr. Buchanan's administration on the eve of the rebellion was essentially a 300-page wasn't my fault letter to history. It didn't help. If anything, it made it worse. By the late 1860s, Buchanan was in poor health, rheumatic disease, failing vision, exhaustion. His political allies were gone. His relevance had expired. He spent his days writing letters, defending himself to anyone who would listen, and hosting increasingly infrequent guests who politely nodded while the country moved on without him. On June 1st, 1868, Buchanan died in his home at the age of 77. Cause of death: respiratory failure, likely worsened by a lingering infection and heart failure. The end was slow and largely unremarkable. The headlines were respectful if not warm. There were no major national tributes, no sweeping reappraisals, just a nation that had outlived him and mostly blamed him. He was buried in Lancaster with a simple stone that read, "The incorruptible statesman whose walk was upon the mountain ranges of the law." But for most of the country, that wasn't how he was remembered. Buchanan was the man who couldn't decide, who wouldn't act, the man who watched the center collapse and chose ambiguity over accountability. And if Buchanan was the ghost of war delayed, the next man was war drunk, A Northerner with Southern sympathies, crushed by grief and drowned in alcohol, Franklin Pierce didn't cause the Civil War, but some say he lit the match and handed it off. And when death came for him, it came during a quiet New England autumn. Almost no one showed up. Franklin Pierce. Franklin Pierce had one of the most tragic lives of any American president, and still his presidency was worse. When he died on October 8th, 1869, alone in a quiet New Hampshire home, there were no grand tributes, no processions, no outpourings of national grief. The country had already forgotten him, if not forgiven. But maybe that was fitting. Pierce had spent most of his life trying to disappear. He was the 14th president of the United States, elected in 1852, largely because he was non-threatening, handsome, and above all, uncontroversial, a unifying figure for a divided nation. What he turned out to be was a tragic placeholder. Within months of his election, Pierce's life was hit by something darker than politics. While traveling by train to Boston with his wife and only surviving son, their car derailed. 11-year-old Benny Pierce was thrown from the wreck and crushed to death before their eyes. The Pierces had already lost 2 children in infancy. Benny was the last. Franklin was never the same. He was inaugurated just weeks later in complete emotional ruin. He refused to swear his oath on a Bible, choosing to affirm it instead, insisting that God had clearly abandoned him, and his presidency unraveled just as fast. His administration's defining act was the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which allowed new territories to decide the slavery issue for themselves. It sounded democratic. It became a nightmare. Bleeding Kansas erupted into violence. Pro- and anti-slavery militias turned towns into battlegrounds. Congress descended into chaos. The act effectively nullified the Missouri Compromise, igniting the chain reaction that would lead to the Civil War. Pierce supported the act, defended it, owned it. When the Democratic Party dumped him for re-election in 1856, replacing him with James Buchanan, Pierce reportedly told a friend, "There's nothing left but to get drunk." He meant it. He returned to New Hampshire and drank heavily. His wife Jane, already a hollow figure of grief, declined further into illness. She died in 1863. Pierce's alcoholism deepened. He refused public office, wrote angry letters about Lincoln, supported the Union technically, but seemed emotionally loyal to the memory of a country that didn't exist anymore. In his final years, he lived in a large home in Concord, isolated and frequently ill. Cirrhosis of the liver, stomach bleeding, and other alcohol-related complications wore him down. He became increasingly reclusive. No children, no wife, no legacy worth defending. When he died at age 64, the country barely noticed. Cause of death, liver failure due to alcoholism. But the emotional cause had come much earlier. Maybe the day Benny died, maybe the day Kansas exploded. He was buried next to his family in the dark soil of New Hampshire. A stone, a flag, and not much else. But while Pierce was fading into obscurity, another man was quietly making his move. Millard Fillmore, Pierce's predecessor in chaos, had taken a different path. He'd stepped in after Taylor's sudden death, tried to keep the Union balanced, then joined a political party nobody wanted to admit ever existed. He didn't die tragically, he died tidily, respectably, entirely on brand. Millard Fillmore. If you were writing a novel and needed a placeholder for a guy who was once president, you could do worse than Millard Fillmore, a man whose legacy is so aggressively moderate that historians still argue over whether he did too little or did nothing at all. When Fillmore died on March 8, 1874, he didn't leave behind tragedy or scandal or war. He left behind a question mark. He was the 13th president of the United States, elevated to the office in 1850 after Zachary Taylor abruptly died, just 16 months into his term. Fillmore was Taylor's vice president, chosen mostly for political geography and party balance, not personal chemistry. The two barely spoke. Suddenly, Fillmore was president. He'd never even met most of Taylor's cabinet before he took office. And when he did, he promptly asked them all to resign. He inherited a deeply fractured country teetering over the issue of slavery, and responded by supporting the Compromise of 1850, a package of laws meant to delay secession by giving each side just enough to hate. It admitted California as a free state. It banned the slave trade in Washington, D.C. It also strengthened the Fugitive Slave Act, making it easier for escaped enslaved people to be hunted down in free states and returned to bondage. Fillmore signed it. all of it. To some, he was a unifier. To others, an appeaser. Abolitionists were enraged. Slaveholders didn't trust him. The Whig Party cracked in half, and Fillmore fell between the pieces. He failed to win his party's nomination in 1852. Then, in 1856, he ran again, this time under the Know Nothing Party, a nativist anti-immigrant group that opposed Catholics, foreigners, and nuance. It was a last gasp. He lost badly. After that, Fillmore retired to Buffalo, New York, where he quietly became a local fixture. He helped found the university at Buffalo. He joined a historical society. He politely declined to join Lincoln's government when the Civil War began. In public, he maintained an air of calm reserve. In private, his views hardened. He blamed the abolitionists for the war. Not slavery, the abolitionists. Still, he lived long enough to see the war end, to see Lincoln assassinated, to see the country stitched together, if only in theory. And then in 1874, he suffered a stroke. He lingered for several weeks before dying at the age of 74. Official cause of death, cerebral hemorrhage. He died at home, peacefully. The newspaper obituaries were respectful, polite, vaguely relieved. Millard Fillmore was buried at Forest Lawn Cemetery in Buffalo. His grave is clean, simple. His name appears in textbooks, mostly as trivia. He was, in many ways, a placeholder between louder men and louder eras, and maybe that's the role he played best. But the next president to die wouldn't go quietly. Andrew Johnson, the man who tried and failed to pick up where Lincoln left off, would go to war with Congress, with his own party, and with the meaning of Reconstruction itself. And in the end, he didn't die in office, but not for lack of trying. Andrew Johnson should have never been president. But then again, neither should Lincoln have been assassinated. When Johnson died on July 31st, 1875, he was a man politically buried long before his body gave out, impeached, exiled, and mostly erased from the national conversation. Johnson was the first U.S. president to stand trial before the Senate, and the last one anyone wanted to see return. And yet, he almost did. Johnson had started life dirt poor in North Carolina, no formal education, trained as a tailor, worked his way up through Tennessee politics as a Southern Democrat who opposed secession. That earned him a curious distinction. When the Civil War broke out, he was the only U.S. senator from a seceding state to stay loyal to the Union. Lincoln noticed. In 1864, he made Johnson his running mate, an attempt to balance the ticket and send a message of national unity. They were sworn in together on March 4th, 1865. 6 weeks later, Lincoln was dead, and the presidency belonged to a man who was loyal to the Union, but not to Lincoln's vision of what should come next. As president, Johnson opposed most of the radical Reconstruction measures Congress passed. He vetoed civil rights legislation, tried to block the 14th Amendment, pardoned large numbers of former Confederates, and insisted that the Union could simply snap back into place without punishment, reform, or protection for newly freed people. Congress disagreed loudly. In 1868, the House of Representatives impeached him, largely over his violation of the Tenure of Office Act, though everyone knew that was a pretext. The real crime was political. The trial went to the Senate, where Johnson escaped removal by a single vote. After his presidency ended, he returned to Tennessee, bitter and still fighting. He ran unsuccessfully for the Senate and House multiple times. Then, in 1875, to everyone's surprise and mild discomfort, he won. Johnson became the only former president ever elected to the Senate. He arrived back in Washington a political ghost, unwanted, unwelcome, and unmistakably present. He served for only a few months. In late July, he traveled back to Tennessee. While visiting family near Elizabethton, he collapsed. 2 strokes hit in rapid succession. He lingered briefly, semi-conscious, before dying at age 66 on July 31st, 1875. Official cause of death, stroke. Final cause, a lifetime of political combat, most of it uphill. He was buried wrapped in an American flag, with a copy of the Constitution as his pillow. For a man who had been nearly cast out of both party and nation, the symbolism was either inspiring or ironic. Andrew Johnson's legacy remains one of contradiction. He preserved the Union, then nearly destroyed the peace. He claimed to fight for the Constitution, but mostly fought anyone who tried to use it to redefine the country. Narrator. But if Johnson was the first president to be impeached, The next to die would be the second to be assassinated. James A. Garfield hadn't even unpacked at the White House when a man with a grudge and a gun ended his presidency and began a slow-motion death that captivated a nation. Up next, the long, infected, excruciating end of James Garfield. James A. Garfield didn't die of a bullet. He died of 1880s medicine. When the 20th president of the United States was shot in a Washington, D.C. train station on July 2nd, 1881, the wound didn't kill him. Not right away. He lived for 79 days, slowly deteriorating in a haze of fever, infection, and well-intentioned malpractice. The bullet wasn't the mystery. The survival was. Garfield had been in office for just 4 months. A former Civil War general and Ohio congressman, he'd risen through the Republican Party like a man trying to escape it. Smart, reluctant, not particularly ambitious. He saw the presidency as something close to a civic duty and immediately got caught in the quicksand of post-Reconstruction politics. But none of that would matter for long. On that humid July morning, Garfield was walking through the Baltimore and Potomac train station when a man named Charles Guiteau stepped forward and shot him twice. Once in the arm, once in the back. Guiteau was a deranged office seeker who believed God had commanded him to kill the president after being denied a consular post. He later claimed, "I did it and will go to jail for it. I am a stalwart, and Arthur is now president." But Garfield didn't die. Not right away. He was taken back to the White House, where doctors crowded around him in their coats and confidence. What followed was a slow-motion murder by infection. None of the attending physicians believed in antiseptic technique. Germ theory was still up for debate, so they probed his wound with unwashed fingers and non-sterile tools, trying to locate the bullet. They couldn't find it. They fed him rectally. They rotated his body hourly. They blistered his skin to draw out the fever. At one point, Alexander Graham Bell attempted to locate the bullet using a prototype metal detector. It failed. Interference from the metal bed frame. Another missed shot. By September, Garfield had been wasting away for nearly 3 months. He was moved to the Jersey Shore for fresh air, but by then he was riddled with abscesses, malnourished, and septic. He died on September 19, 1881. He was 49 years old. Official cause of death: sepsis and internal hemorrhaging. Real cause: confidence without knowledge, and a bullet left in place by people who insisted they were doing everything right. His assassin, Guiteau, was hanged. His successor, Chester Arthur, assumed the office, but Garfield's death lingered, not because of who he was, but because of how it happened. He was buried in Cleveland under an elaborate memorial tower, and his drawn-out suffering would eventually lead to reforms in civil service and medicine. His death was, if nothing else, a tipping point. But for the next president to die, suffering came in a different form. Ulysses S. Grant didn't die suddenly. He died writing painfully, page by page, trying to finish his memoirs before cancer took away his voice, and then his life. He wasn't just dying. He was racing a deadline, and the Union's most famous general was determined not to lose this final battle. Ulysses S. Grant. By the end, Ulysses S. Grant could barely speak. His voice, once loud enough to command armies, had been reduced to scribbles on a legal pad. He didn't die in uniform or in the White House or on a battlefield. He died in a rented cottage in the mountains of New York, surrounded by silence and paper. And he knew it was coming. That's what made it worse. Grant had survived war, scandal, and terminal modesty. He wasn't supposed to be president, just a general, reluctantly pulled into politics by the same nation that once handed him every army and told him to hold the line. He did. He won, and then he kept on serving. But the presidency wasn't like war. There were no clear enemies, no flags to capture, no Appomattox. Just corruption, factionalism, and political potholes disguised as compromise. His administration would later be remembered for its scandals, though not always tied to him directly. Grant's sin wasn't villainy, it was loyalty, especially to people who didn't deserve it. After leaving the White House in 1877, he traveled the world, greeted like a hero in Europe, wined and dined in Asia, applauded in capitals that had once read about the Civil War in dispatches. For a moment, he was untouchable again, and then he came home to financial ruin. In 1884, a Ponzi-style investment scam wiped out his savings. He was broke. The former president and Union hero had to pawn heirlooms just to pay the bills. And then, almost on cue, came the final blow: throat cancer. Grant had smoked 20 cigars a day during the war. He made generals nervous with how calmly he lit them mid-battle. Now his throat was collapsing. Food became impossible. Speaking, torturous. But he didn't stop. Instead, he made a deal. Mark Twain, yes, that Mark Twain, offered him a publishing contract, a full set of personal memoirs. Grant, now a dying man, said yes. And so began his last campaign. A race to finish his story before the cancer silenced him for good. He wrote through the pain, dictated until he couldn't, then scribbled with a pencil. He wrote about the war, about Lincoln, about strategy. He skipped the presidency entirely. It was clear what he wanted to be remembered for. His family read to him. His voice gave out. He drank water by the spoonful. He wrote faster. On July 23, 1885, Ulysses S. Grant died at Mount McGregor in upstate New York. He was 63. Cause of death: throat cancer, accelerated by starvation and exhaustion. Cause of survival: sheer will. He finished the book. Barely. His final draft was complete just days before he died. The memoirs were a bestseller. The royalties saved his family from poverty. Mark Twain said Grant's writing was the most remarkable work of its kind since Caesar's Commentaries. They buried him in New York City. His tomb, Grant's tomb, still stands along the Hudson River, a marble statement that, if nothing else, he endured. But the next to die would go more quietly. Chester A. Arthur, who had inherited the office from a murdered president, faded out of life with no audience, no scandal, and almost no sound. Chester A. Arthur. Chester Alan Arthur was the most surprising president no one asked for. He entered the White House in 1881 under a cloud of tragedy. After the slow, painful assassination of James A. Garfield, no one expected much from him. Some people didn't even expect legitimacy. He was considered a machine politician, a crony, a placeholder in fine whiskers, but then he did something radical. He got serious. As president, Arthur championed civil service reform, signed the Pendleton Act, and began cleaning up the very spoil system that had given him a career. Washington was stunned. Reformers didn't trust him. Party bosses were furious. But Arthur, who had once been fired for corruption, now appeared more interested in honor than loyalty. He kept a clean schedule, dressed impeccably, and governed with a strange, melancholic grace. He rarely spoke about Garfield, rarely invoked tragedy, but privately he was haunted. And maybe that was because he knew his time was limited. By the end of his presidency, Arthur was seriously ill. He had been quietly suffering from Bright's disease, a chronic kidney condition, incurable at the time. His energy flagged. He lost weight. He took to long walks alone through Lafayette Square, speaking to no one. He refused to run for a second term. He barely fought it. After leaving office in 1885, Arthur returned to New York City, moved into a brownstone, and tried to disappear with dignity. He avoided public appearances, declined interviews, and watched silently as Grover Cleveland took over the White House. His final years were marked by fatigue, private treatment, and withdrawal. The sharp lines of his presidency dulled into the quiet aches of daily survival. The once elegant host became a ghost in his own home. On November 18, 1886, at the age of 57, Chester A. Arthur died in his bed in Manhattan. Cause of death: complications from Bright's disease, including kidney failure and cardiovascular collapse. He had known it was coming for years. His funeral was modest. A few hundred dignitaries. A brief service. No grand legacy building. Just a man who had become president by accident, served with more grace than expected, and left without trying to make noise. He was buried in Albany, New York, next to his wife, Ellen, who had died more than 5 years earlier. Arthur had mourned her in silence throughout his presidency. He never remarried. There is no Arthur Memorial in Washington, no great Arthur revival in political rhetoric, but the man who entered office as a punchline left it as a reformer. Quiet, wounded, underestimated to the end, but the man who followed him in death had known war, peace, and everything in between. Rutherford B. Hayes, the compromise president, would die as he lived, calmly, controversial, and mostly on his own terms. Rutherford B. Hayes. Rutherford B. Hayes might be the closest thing the United States ever had to a presidential footnote with a beard. He became president through a backroom deal. He left after a single term. And when he died on January the 17th, 1893, the most common reaction was polite confusion. Wait, he was still alive? But Hayes mattered. Even if history treated him like a placeholder, he was the 19th president of the United States and the man who ended Reconstruction, not with a law or a speech, but with a handshake deal that still cast shadows. The Compromise of 1877 gave Hayes the presidency after a disputed election that nearly derailed the Republic. In exchange, he agreed to pull federal troops out of the South, effectively ending military enforcement of Black civil rights. The South was left to govern itself, something it quickly weaponized into a century of voter suppression, racial terror, and Jim Crow. Hayes said it was for national healing. His critics called it surrender. Either way, the decision defined him. Hayes served just one term. He declined to run again. In office, he was stern, well-meaning, and generally allergic to charisma. He banned alcohol in the White House. He hated patronage politics. He believed deeply that virtue could replace violence. After leaving Washington, he retreated to his estate in Fremont, Ohio, Spiegel Grove. There he lived out the rest of his life like a Victorian civic booster, championing prison reform, education access, and veterans affairs. He wrote letters, he gave speeches, and he seemed quietly obsessed with cleaning up the mess his presidency had left behind. Privately, he struggled. His wife, Lucy, Lemonade Lucy, nicknamed for banning booze from state dinners, died in 1889. Hayes never really recovered. He aged fast. His health declined in the early 1890s. Shortness of breath, heart palpitations, fatigue. In January of 1893, he suffered a massive heart attack. He died surrounded by family, reportedly saying, "I know I am going where Lucy is." He was 70 years old. Cause of death, heart failure. He was buried next to Lucy at Spiegel Grove, under trees he had planted himself. Years later, his home would become a presidential museum. School children would visit. Teachers would vaguely remember his name. Today, Hayes is remembered mostly for how he became president, not for what he did while in office. His legacy is built on compromise, and like most compromises, it pleased no one for long. But the next man to die didn't win through a deal. He won through legacy. Benjamin Harrison, grandson of one president, successor to another, would leave a very different trail. Less compromise, more thunder, more tariffs. And when death came for him, it came during a storm. Benjamin Harrison. Benjamin Harrison was the last U.S. president of the 19th century to die, and the only one who could say he was the grandson of another. That wasn't his fault, but it followed him. As the grandson of William Henry Harrison, the president who famously talked himself to death in 30 days, Benjamin entered politics with the ghost of legacy breathing down his neck. By the time he became the 23rd president of the United States in 1889, people had already decided what kind of man he was. Victorian, upright, serious, cold. He didn't bother to correct them. Harrison was a Civil War general. A lawyer, a man who measured his words like they cost money and who approached the presidency like it was jury duty, and he got things done. Raised tariffs, expanded the Navy, admitted 6 new states, and signed the Sherman Antitrust Act, which would go on to shape economic policy for over a century. He also lost re-election to Grover Cleveland, the very man he'd replaced. After leaving office in 1893, Harrison returned to Indiana and mostly faded into privacy. He taught law, traveled sparingly, and married his much younger second wife. His first, Caroline, had died of tuberculosis while he was still in office. The age gap caused a scandal. He didn't seem to care. By 1901, Harrison was in declining health. Pneumonia struck in late winter, and his condition worsened quickly. He refused visitors, refused to panic, and in typical Harrison fashion, he seemed almost bureaucratic about his own death. On March 13th, 1901, he died in Indianapolis. He was 67 years old. Cause of death, pneumonia, complicated by influenza and pre-existing health issues. There were tributes, respectful, muted ones. His funeral was dignified but not grand. He didn't inspire fan clubs. There were no major statues raised in his honor. His presidency was effective but unsentimental. His death felt the same, and yet Harrison's life marked the closing of a chapter. He was the last Civil War general to serve as president, the last to wear full beards and high collars into the modern age. After him, the country would tilt into a new century, into industry, empire, and marketing. Charisma would start to matter more than integrity. Power would get louder. He lies buried in Crown Hill Cemetery in Indianapolis, not forgotten, but not exactly remembered with passion. But if Harrison's death closed the 19th century with a whisper, the next would break the 20th open with a gunshot. William McKinley. William McKinley wasn't a showman. He didn't wrestle bears or give booming speeches. He didn't tweet or whatever the 19th century version of that was. He shook hands, gave calm reassurances, and made annexing half the Pacific Ocean look like a Sunday chore. He was, in many ways, the last of the quiet presidents. And then someone shot him. On September 6, 1901, McKinley was attending the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. It was a World's Fair, a glowing, electric, forward-looking spectacle. He was in the middle of a receiving line shaking hands with the public, something he insisted on doing personally, when a man approached with a hand wrapped in a bandage. Inside the bandage was a pistol. Leon Czolgosz, an anarchist, fired 2 shots into McKinley's abdomen at point-blank range. The crowd screamed. The president staggered backward and whispered to his bodyguards, "Don't let them hurt him." They didn't. They beat Czolgosz to the ground. But the real threat was already inside McKinley. Doctors arrived quickly, but made critical errors. One bullet had lodged deep in his stomach. They couldn't find it. They stitched him up anyway, confident he'd recover. For a few days, it seemed like they might be right. Then came the infection. On September 14th, 1901, 8 days after the shooting, McKinley died in a coma. His final words, reportedly, "It is God's way. His will, not ours, be done." He was 58 years old. Cause of death, gangrene from an abdominal wound, worsened by 1901 medical optimism. His funeral was massive. Streets filled, flags dropped, newspapers blacked out their mastheads. McKinley had guided the country through the Spanish-American War, helped secure overseas territories, and stabilized the post-Civil War economy. He was the steady hand before the Roosevelt thunder. But McKinley's death didn't just shock the country, it catapulted it. His assassination made Theodore Roosevelt president, the youngest ever, the loudest ever, and arguably the first of the modern presidents. The office would never again be a quiet desk job. As for Czolgosz, he was executed by electric chair within weeks. His last words, "I killed the president because he was the enemy of the good people, the working people." The Secret Service, which had previously existed only in a financial crimes capacity, was immediately assigned to presidential protection. A new rule book was written on the fly, in the aftermath of a public shooting at a World's Fair. McKinley was buried in Canton, Ohio, beneath a towering monument, almost compensatory in its grandeur. For a man known for calm and caution, his ending became one of the loudest political pivots in American history, and waiting in the wings was Theodore Roosevelt, young, eager, and ready to swing. But this story isn't about Teddy, because the next to die wasn't a warrior or a cowboy or a reformer. It was Grover Cleveland, the only man ever elected to 2 non-consecutive terms, and the last president who probably wouldn't survive modern media. Grover Cleveland is mostly remembered for a math problem. He was the 22nd and the 24th president of the United States, 2 non-consecutive terms, 1 presidency with a gap in the middle. But what gets lost between the trivia is the man himself, big, brooding, blunt, and almost constitutionally allergic to political flair. When he died on June 24th, 1908, at the age of 71, Cleveland had been out of the public spotlight for more than a decade, and that suited him just fine. He was at heart a private man who kept being dragged onto the national stage, first as a reform-minded governor of New York, then as a Democrat, in a time when the party had no idea what it stood for. He won the presidency in 1884, lost it in 1888, and then came back in 1892 like a returning employee who hated being rehired. He was honest, hard-edged, and often unpopular, sometimes for good reasons. He vetoed hundreds of bills, opposed pensions for Civil War veterans, and handled economic panic with something between indifference and open hostility. His core philosophy was, the government should do less. But Cleveland's real legacy was paradox. He fought corruption but surrounded himself with loyalists. He was a Democrat who often sided with business interests. He ran as a man of the people and then lectured them on hard money policy. And in 1894, when a massive railroad strike paralyzed the country, he sent in federal troops without the governor's consent to crush it. Dozens died. He said he was preserving order. Labor said he declared war. After leaving office in 1897, he moved to Princeton, New Jersey, taught a little, spoke less, reflected a lot. His weight fluctuated, his health declined, and by 1907, he was mostly confined to his home. Kidney disease, heart trouble, and digestive issues combined into a slow fade. In his final days, he reportedly told his doctor, "I have tried so hard to do right." On June 24th, 1908, Grover Cleveland died quietly in his bed. His wife, Frances, outlived him by almost 40 years. Cause of death? Heart attack, brought on by chronic intestinal disease and kidney failure. He was buried in Princeton Cemetery under a modest stone, in keeping with the man himself, who had once secretly undergone cancer surgery on a boat in the middle of the night to avoid scaring the public. Yes, that happened. Cleveland's death didn't cause shock or headlines. He was already a relic by 1908, a president from a grittier, quieter era, out of step with the rising age of charisma. But the next president to die would have plenty of that. Theodore Roosevelt wasn't a quiet reformer. He was a human headline, a force of personality. And when his heart finally stopped, it wasn't after a scandal or a battle, it was in his sleep. Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt did everything loud. He shouted his way into the Spanish-American War, shouted into the White House, shouted reform into monopolies and national parks and foreign diplomacy. His voice shaped a century. And then, just like that, it stopped. On January 6th, 1919, at the age of 60, Roosevelt died quietly in his sleep. No drama, no farewell speech, just a failed heart after a life that refused to fail. He'd once famously said, "I wish to preach, not the doctrine of ignoble ease." He never lived an easy day, and it killed him. Roosevelt had lived more lives than most presidents. Harvard graduate, cattle rancher, NYPD commissioner, war hero, assistant secretary of the Navy, vice president, youngest president, big game hunter, Amazon explorer, third-party candidate, pulp writer. He boxed in the White House, read a book a day, walked so fast people pretended to limp to get out of hiking trips with him. He once got shot during a campaign speech and finished the speech before going to the hospital. That was Teddy on a quiet Tuesday, but his health had been declining for years. In 1918, after a leg infection sustained during a jungle expedition nearly killed him, Roosevelt never fully recovered. He had chronic inflammatory rheumatism, likely polymyalgia rheumatica, and recurring infections. His eyesight failed in one eye. He suffered from severe pain in his joints. He took to dictating letters from bed, surrounded by books and animal heads. Then came the final blow. A blood clot brought on by chronic inflammation and past trauma traveled to his lungs. In the early hours of January the 6th, 1919, he died in his sleep at Sagamore Hill, his home in Oyster Bay, New York. The man who had charged up San Juan Hill stared down trusts and reshaped the American presidency didn't make a sound. His son, Archie, sent a telegram. "The old lion is dead." There was something mythical about his exit. He had been the biggest personality in American politics. By volume, by velocity, the country felt suddenly quieter and smaller. His funeral was modest, per his wishes. No grand procession, no military ceremony. He was buried on a quiet hillside, overlooking the bay. There would be no more like him, because there couldn't be. But if Roosevelt died with his legacy sealed, the next president to die left behind nothing but mystery. Warren G. Harding was a man elected to soothe a war-weary nation. He ended up in a hotel room in San Francisco, collapsing from what doctors claimed was a stroke. But almost immediately, the rumors began. Warren G. Harding wanted to be liked. That was the problem. He wasn't obsessed with power or legacy or policy. He was obsessed with being popular. He smiled constantly, looked presidential in profile, gave speeches that sounded good even when they didn't say much, and won the presidency in a landslide in 1920 by promising one simple thing: a return to normalcy. Never mind that normalcy wasn't technically a word. For a while, the normalcy thing worked. The war was over. The pandemic had passed. The country wanted less stress, less drama, and less idealism. Harding gave them all three. But behind the soft voice and warm handshakes, something darker was building. His administration became a machine of corruption, grimy with backdoor deals, kickbacks, and scandals that would surface only after he was gone. The biggest? Teapot Dome, an oil leasing bribery scheme so enormous that it would land his Interior Secretary in prison and redefine political corruption for decades. Harding himself was never directly implicated, but the stink clung to him. In the summer of 1923, amid mounting stress and rumors, Harding launched a national speaking tour, part public relations campaign, part cross-country escape route. He called it the Voyage of Understanding. It ended in San Francisco. On August 2nd, 1923, while resting in the Palace Hotel, Harding collapsed in bed. His wife Florence had been reading to him. He gave a convulsive jerk, a breathless gasp, and died. He was 57 years old. Cause of death: officially a heart attack or stroke, but no autopsy was ever performed. Florence refused it. And just like that, the president was gone, and the conspiracy theories arrived. Some believed he'd been poisoned by enemies, by his wife, or by his own anxiety. Others believed he'd simply cracked under the weight of secrets he couldn't control. He'd spent his presidency keeping friends happy, favors paid, and scandal at bay. By the end, none of it held. He was buried in Marion, Ohio, beneath a towering white memorial, but his legacy remains permanently foggy. A president remembered not for what he did, but for how quickly it all fell apart once he wasn't there to smile through it. But while Harding unraveled in scandal, the man who came before him was unraveling in private. Woodrow Wilson, the idealist, the wartime orator, the League of Nations dreamer, had already been half paralyzed and politically sidelined by the time Harding took office. And just a year after Harding's sudden death, Wilson finally followed. No conspiracy, no drama, just a stroke survivor slowly fading in a house that used to feel bigger. Woodrow Wilson's real death didn't happen in 1924. It happened in 1919 in a bedroom, behind closed doors, where the 28th President of the United States suffered a massive stroke that left him half paralyzed and barely coherent. Everything after that, just political theater, a ghost pretending to be a man in charge. By the time Wilson officially died on February 3rd, 1924, he had already been out of office for nearly 3 years. He had been invisible for longer than that. Let's rewind. Wilson was once the very model of a modern moral president, intellectual, visionary, dangerously convinced of his own righteousness. He signed the Federal Reserve into existence, created the Federal Trade Commission, resegregated the federal government, won a world war, invented a league to prevent the next one, declared neutrality, then declared war. The contradictions were endless. So was his confidence, but the war cost him. During the grueling campaign to ratify the Treaty of Versailles and secure U.S. entry into the League of Nations, Wilson collapsed. He had been on a whistle-stop tour, giving speeches at full throttle. His health, already fragile from years of stress and undiagnosed hypertension, gave out. In October 1919, Wilson suffered a massive stroke. For the remainder of his presidency, Wilson was incapacitated, partially paralyzed, blind in one eye, slurring words, unable to stand for more than a few minutes. And the public didn't know, the press didn't report it. There was no constitutional mechanism at the time to transfer power. So for the next 17 months, the United States of America was essentially governed by Edith Wilson, his wife, who screened visitors, filtered documents, and made decisions on his behalf. She later referred to herself as a steward of the presidency. Historians have other words. Wilson limped out of office in 1921 and into a townhouse in Washington, D.C., where he became the only president to remain in the Capitol after leaving office. He rarely spoke publicly again, rarely appeared at all. By the early 1920s, he was a frail shadow of his former self. Wheelchair-bound, isolated, obsessed with defending his legacy. He wrote letters, corrected biographies, listened to music, sat in silence. On February 3rd, 1924, he died in bed. There was no final speech, no grand exit, just the quiet extinguishing of a man who had once held Europe's fate in his hands. He was 67 years old. Cause of death, complications from the stroke, cardiovascular collapse. His funeral was small, private, held in Washington. He was buried at the Washington National Cathedral, the only U.S. president interred in the capital city. Today, Wilson is remembered as both a visionary and a cautionary tale. The man who won peace but couldn't hold it. The man who preached self-determination abroad while segregating his own government at home. The man who died in two parts, once as a body, once as a presidency. But the next to go would die with less mystery and more stillness. William Howard Taft, the only man to serve as both president and chief justice, would spend his final years not chasing ambition, but managing the Supreme Court like a careful librarian. And when death came, it came with restraint, like everything else he did after the presidency. William Howard Taft. By the time William Howard Taft died on March 8th, 1930, most Americans remembered him as the president who got stuck in a bathtub, which is unfortunate because he never did, and also because he was one of the most uniquely qualified and uniquely reluctant presidents in U.S. history. Taft didn't want the presidency, he wanted the Supreme Court, and eventually he got both. He was the 27th President of the United States and later became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the only person in American history to hold both offices. The first job made him miserable. The second made him whole. Taft was handpicked by Theodore Roosevelt as his successor in 1908, and it was a decision both men came to regret. Where Roosevelt was energy incarnate, Taft was slow, methodical, and deliberate. He hated confrontation. He preferred courts to crowds. Roosevelt called him a fathead. Taft never really got over it. As president, Taft was competent, often deeply so. He busted more trust than Roosevelt, strengthened the Interstate Commerce Commission, gave us the 16th Amendment, income tax, and the 17th direct election of senators. But none of it landed. He was a legalist in a populist age, and it showed. He lost re-election in 1912, humiliatingly, when Roosevelt returned to run against him, splitting the Republican vote and handing the win to Woodrow Wilson. Taft went back to Yale to teach law. Smiled more, slept better, waited. In 1921, President Harding made it official. Taft was named Chief Justice of the United States, and there, finally, he came alive. He modernized the judiciary, pushed for new federal court buildings, and fought to streamline case management. He also presided over landmark decisions and famously disliked dissents. He wanted the court to speak with one voice. By the late 1920s, though, his health was fading. He suffered from heart disease, high blood pressure, and bladder problems. His massive frame, he once weighed over 330 pounds, had thinned significantly. He grew weaker by the month. In February 1930, he resigned from the court, barely able to walk, almost blind. Weeks later, he died in Washington, D.C. at the age of 72. Cause of death, cardiovascular disease complicated by urological issues and exhaustion. He was given a full state funeral, the first president to be buried at Arlington National Cemetery. His gravestone bears no bathtub jokes, just the quiet dignity of a man who found peace where he always belonged, in the law. Taft didn't need noise. He didn't chase power. He served, left, and then served again, more happily the second time. But the next death wouldn't be in robes or silence. Calvin Coolidge, the president of few words, would exit with the same minimalism he brought to the White House. Calvin Coolidge was so quiet, people joked he might already be dead while still in office. Turns out, they weren't that far off. When he died on January the 5th, 1933, at the age of 60, it surprised almost no one. And everyone. No long illness, no farewell tour, just a former president, alone in his house, suddenly gone. Death by understatement. But then, understatement was his brand. Coolidge came to the presidency in 1923 after the sudden death of Warren G. Harding. Where Harding had been all charm and backroom deals, Coolidge was restraint incarnate. He spoke rarely, slept often, delegated heavily, and believed deeply that government should be small, quiet, and ideally invisible. He famously said, "The business of America is business." And then he let business do its thing. The roaring 20s roared. Stocks climbed. Radio boomed. The country danced into a decade-long party, and Coolidge just kept nodding silently in the background. He won a full term in 1924, then declined to run in 1928, stating simply, "I do not choose to run for president in 1928. That was it. No explanation. Just Coolidge, ghosting the presidency before it was trendy. In retirement, he returned to Northampton, Massachusetts, resumed writing his memoirs, and enjoyed the peace and quiet he had always craved. He published articles, went fishing, and watched the country hurtle toward a financial cliff he'd unknowingly helped build. Because when the Great Depression hit in 1929, just months after he left office, Coolidge didn't say much. He believed the market would correct itself. It didn't, but by then, it wasn't his problem anymore. His health, meanwhile, was failing quietly. High blood pressure, heart issues, but no drama. On the afternoon of January 5th, 1933, Grace Coolidge found him collapsed on the bathroom floor of their home. He had been shaving. Cause of death, sudden heart attack. The country was already distracted. Roosevelt had just been elected. Hoover was still trying to explain the economy, and Hitler was making headlines in Germany. Coolidge's death felt like an afterthought, a quiet punctuation mark at the end of a chaotic sentence. He was buried in Plymouth Notch, Vermont, in a small family plot with a view of the hills. The headstone is simple, predictable, entirely appropriate. There was no mythologizing, no scandals to dig up, no national reckoning, just a quiet man who became president, served without spectacle, and then died in the same key he lived. But quiet wouldn't last long, because the next president to die had stared down depression, dictatorship, and the dead weight of 4 terms in office. Franklin D. Roosevelt. Franklin Delano. Roosevelt died in a chair, mid-sentence, mid-war, mid-portrait. It was April 12th, 1945, and the country was weeks away from victory in Europe. The war in the Pacific was still raging. The atomic bomb was still a secret. But the presidency, his presidency, was already exhausted. FDR had been elected 4 times, led the country through the Great Depression, redefined the role of government, transformed the executive branch into the axis of modern American power. He wasn't just the longest-serving president, he was the blueprint. But by the end, the body behind the voice had been quietly falling apart. He had suffered from polio since his late 30s, leaving his legs paralyzed. That part the public knew. But what they didn't know, because his doctors didn't tell them, was that by his 4th term, Roosevelt was dying of uncontrolled hypertension, heart disease, and the slow erosion of someone who believed the world could only be saved if he stayed upright long enough. In the spring of 1945, he retreated to Warm Springs, Georgia, a place where he had once felt restored, his little White House. There on a peaceful afternoon, as an artist painted his portrait, Roosevelt placed his hand on his head and said, "I have a terrific pain in the back of my head." And that was it. He slumped forward. The brush froze. The room fell silent. Cause of death, massive cerebral hemorrhage. A fatal stroke. He was 63 years old. Vice President Harry Truman, only 82 days into the job, was called to the White House and told the news in a whisper. His reply? Jesus Christ and General Jackson. The country mourned as if it had lost a father. FDR had been the only president many Americans had ever known. His portrait had hung in kitchens, post offices, union halls, and tenement stairwells. Now he was gone. He was buried in Hyde Park, New York, at his family estate, with a plain headstone beneath a flag. His final portrait, left unfinished at the moment of collapse, still hangs beside the version completed later, like a before and after photo of a man erased by history in a single breath. And yet, FDR's death, natural, expected, almost poetic, was not the template the future would follow. Because the next presidential death wouldn't be a quiet fade in the countryside. It would be a bullet in broad daylight during a parade. It would shatter illusions, freeze a nation, and be replayed for the rest of the century. John F. Kennedy. It was supposed to be a campaign stop. A bright, warm November day in Texas. The president, in a convertible, waving to crowds. Flashbulbs, smiles, cheering, and then silence, followed by a sound no one ever forgot. On November 22nd, 1963, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States, was assassinated in Dealey Plaza, Dallas, Texas, at 12:30 p.m. Central Time. The motorcade was moving slowly. The president was seated beside First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy, both beaming, basking in the attention. Texas Governor John Connally and his wife were in front. The Secret Service was relaxed, too relaxed. And then from a sixth-floor window of the Texas School Book Depository, Lee Harvey Oswald fired 3 shots. One missed. One hit both Kennedy and Connally. The third, the headshot, erased the rest of the day. Kennedy slumped left. Jackie didn't scream. She climbed onto the back of the car in shock. Secret Service agent Clint Hill leapt on board. The car accelerated. Somewhere, a bystander fainted. Somewhere else, the Zapruder camera kept rolling. The president was rushed to Parkland Memorial Hospital. He was barely alive. 30 minutes later, he wasn't. Official time of death, 1 p.m. He was 46 years old. Cause of death, gunshot wound to the head. The death was instant. The trauma was not. For the first time in American history, the death of a president was witnessed in real time, recorded, replayed, studied, and doubted. The conspiracy theories started before the blood had dried. Was it Oswald? Was he alone? Was it the CIA? The mob? Castro? The Secret Service? Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson? The Warren Commission said Oswald acted alone. Millions didn't believe it. Still don't. Kennedy's body was flown back to Washington. Jackie refused to change her bloodstained clothes. Let them see what they've done, she said. The funeral was televised. His 3-year-old son, John Jr., saluted his father's casket. Black horses, silent drums, heads bowed across continents. Kennedy had served just over 1,000 days in office, but his death expanded that tenure into myth. The youngest elected president, the first Catholic president, the symbol of youth, vigor, and Camelot, gone in seconds. His words, ask not, new frontier, ich bin ein Berliner, now sounded like epitaphs. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery beneath an eternal flame, watched over by an America that hadn't blinked since Dallas. And yet, for all the trauma of that November day, JFK's death was not the end of the Kennedy story, only the most televised chapter. But the next to go wasn't a prince of Camelot. It was Herbert Hoover, the oldest living ex-president at the time, a man who had outlived his reputation by nearly 30 years. Herbert Hoover was still alive. That was the punchline in 1964. When he died on October 20th, 1964, at the age of 90, he had outlived every president before him. He'd outlived the Great Depression, the New Deal, the Second World War, the Cold War's arrival, and the Kennedy assassination. He'd outlived mockery. He'd outlived relevance. He'd outlived the conversation. But once, long ago, he had been the conversation. Hoover was elected in 1928, a self-made millionaire and humanitarian, a man who had fed post-war Europe and symbolized technocratic hope, a brilliant engineer, a believer in efficiency, a Quaker with a calculator. And then the stock market crashed. The Great Depression arrived less than a year into his presidency, and Hoover was its scapegoat, not because he caused it, but because he didn't stop it. Or worse, because he didn't seem to think the federal government should try. He opposed direct relief, believed the economy would self-correct. He talked about rugged individualism as millions stood in breadlines and banks shuddered. Protesters camped in Washington. He sent the army to remove them. It didn't look good. It didn't end well. In 1932, he lost re-election to Franklin D. Roosevelt in a landslide and became synonymous with failure. Hoovervilles, the shanty towns of the homeless, made sure of that. But Hoover didn't disappear. In fact, he refused to disappear. After his presidency, he went quiet. Then he went to work. He wrote, spoke, reinvented himself as an elder statesman. And ironically, it was President Truman, a Democrat, who brought Hoover back into public service, asking him to reorganize the executive branch and post-war relief programs. Hoover accepted. By the 1950s, he was a respected voice again. Still controversial, still anti-New Deal, but no longer a punchline, just a monument, breathing. He spent his final years in New York's Waldorf Astoria Hotel, writing, reflecting, occasionally spotted by people who did double takes. He's still alive. And then quietly, he wasn't. On October 20th, 1964, Herbert Hoover died of internal bleeding brought on by colon cancer. He was buried in West Branch, Iowa, near the cottage where he'd been born. Before the world wars, before the market crashes, before the slogans, he had been president for 4 years. He was an ex-president for 31. He lived long enough to see his failures taught in textbooks and lived long enough to start arguing with those textbooks. But the next president to die wouldn't live long enough to argue with anyone. Dwight D. Eisenhower, the general, the moderate, the bridge between wars, would collapse from the same kind of heart that had once won him the world. Dwight D. Eisenhower. Dwight D. Eisenhower knew what the end looked like. He'd seen it on beaches, in trenches, in maps drawn with arrows and casualty estimates. But when death finally came for him on March 28th, 1969, there were no troops, no orders, just the slow failure of the very body that once carried the free world on its shoulders. He was 78 years old. Before he was president, Eisenhower was a general, but not just any general, the supreme Allied commander in Europe during World War II, architect of D-Day, a soldier who hated war and spent his retirement warning about the military-industrial complex that had made him famous. When he became the 34th president in 1953, America wanted calm. Eisenhower gave them order, infrastructure, containment, golf. His presidency was 8 years of balance between the Cold War and consumerism, McCarthyism and moderation, the past and a future trying to happen too fast. And through it all, he kept having heart attacks. The first major one came in 1955 during his first term. He recovered, but barely. In 1956, he needed an intestinal surgery. In 1957, he had a stroke. By the end of his presidency, he was a walking list of cardiovascular failures, but still more trusted than most men half his age. After leaving office in 1961, Eisenhower retired to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, just a few miles from the bloodiest battlefield in American history. Fitting. He spent his final years writing memoirs, advising presidents, and living like a man who had already completed the hard part. But his heart didn't agree. By 1968, Eisenhower had been hospitalized multiple times. He suffered a series of heart attacks and was admitted to Walter Reed Medical Center. He stayed there for 10 months, a slow march toward the inevitable. By early 1969, he was slipping in and out of consciousness. President Nixon, his former vice president, visited him repeatedly. So did world leaders, clergy, family, but Eisenhower said little. Just before the end, he whispered, "I want to go. God take me." On March 28, 1969, his heart gave out for the last time. Cause of death, congestive heart failure, after years of coronary disease and repeated heart attacks. He lay in state at the Capitol Rotunda, then again in Abilene, Kansas, where he was buried next to his son. His funeral was national, but not grandiose, just disciplined, respectful, and unmistakably military. Eisenhower had once commanded millions. He died like a man who understood surrender when it finally came from within. But while Eisenhower had years to reflect on his legacy, the next president to die had just 5 years of retirement, and only one term of presidency to make his mark. Harry S. Truman, the man who dropped the bomb, desegregated the military and never looked back, would die with fewer regrets than most. Harry S. Truman. Harry S. Truman never asked for the job, and once he got it, he never pretended to be anything other than a man doing his best with the worst hand imaginable. He was handed the presidency in April 1945, after Franklin D. Roosevelt died mid-term and mid-war. Truman wasn't in the loop. He hadn't been briefed on the atomic bomb. His first weeks in office were a crash course in apocalypse management. And yet, he acted. He authorized the nuclear strikes on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, ending World War II, and beginning a moral debate that never ended. He rebuilt Europe with the Marshall Plan, recognized Israel, desegregated the military, created NATO, and committed U.S. troops to Korea. And for all of it, he got hammered by critics from both parties. He left office in 1953 with abysmal approval ratings, but he didn't seem to mind. He wasn't built for applause. He was built for decisions. After the presidency, Truman went home to Independence, Missouri. No entourage, no money, no speech circuit. He lived off a modest army pension, walked to the library by himself, and wrote his memoirs with quiet stubbornness. He turned down corporate boards and free cars. When a company tried to send him one as a gift, he mailed it back. For 20 years, he stayed there, steady, undramatic, writing letters, visiting the library, becoming a relic in real time. By the early 1970s, Truman's health began to fail. He suffered from pneumonia and complications quickly set in. He was hospitalized in December 1972. The infection spread. His kidneys began to fail. He slipped in and out of consciousness. On December 26, 1972, Harry S. Truman died at the age of 88. Cause of death: multiple organ failure, triggered by pneumonia. His funeral was understated. No spectacle. Just a man buried on the grounds of the Harry S. Truman Library, next to his wife Bess and daughter Margaret. His gravestone is plain. His record is not. He once said, "I never did give anybody hell. I just told the truth and they thought it was hell." Turns out the country came around. Today, Truman is remembered as one of the most consequential presidents of the 20th century, an accidental leader who ended up shaping the modern world. But while Truman's final years were peaceful, the next president to die went out surrounded by the noise of a country he no longer recognized. Lyndon B. Johnson, the deal maker, the arm twister, the architect of the Great Society, died just 29 days later, heart failing as fast as the country's faith in power. Lyndon B. Johnson. Lyndon B. Johnson died the same way he lived, suddenly, forcefully, and in the middle of a conversation no one had finished. On January 22, 1973, just 29 days after Harry S. Truman died, Johnson suffered a massive heart attack alone at his ranch in Stonewall, Texas. His Secret Service agents found him on the bedroom floor, the phone still dangling in his hand. He was calling for help, but this time the help came too late. He was 64 years old. The same week, Richard Nixon was being sworn in for a second term. It was the final scene in one of the most intense, controversial, and uniquely American presidencies of the 20th century. LBJ had started as a school teacher in the Texas Hill Country. He became a senator, then a master of the Senate, then John F. Kennedy's vice president, and after Dallas, the unexpected inheritor of a dream. And he ran with it. Within a year of JFK's assassination, Johnson passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, followed by Medicare, Medicaid, the Voting Rights Act, Head Start, public broadcasting, environmental laws, education funding, and fair housing. He called it the Great Society, but it came with a price: a war. Johnson escalated American involvement in Vietnam from advisors and support to full-on ground troops, bombings, and body bags. The same man who signed the Civil Rights Act also sent 500,000 Americans into a jungle they couldn't seem to leave. Nightly news showed the cost. So did college campuses. So did the 1968 Democratic National Convention, where riot police outnumbered applause. LBJ, the political bulldozer, lost the public, and eventually he lost the will to fight for another term. In March 1968, he shocked the country. "I shall not seek, and I will not accept, the nomination of my party for another term as your president." And with that, he walked away. He retired to his ranch, grew his hair out, rode the fence lines, gained weight, smoked constantly. Despite repeated heart attacks, he watched the war he couldn't win finally end on someone else's watch. He watched civil rights get chipped away. He watched a nation he tried to fix turn the volume up on its discontent. By 1972, his heart was failing badly. He knew it. He was taking nitroglycerin pills like candy. His arteries were clogged. He was living on stubbornness alone. And then, one January afternoon, it ended. Cause of death: massive heart attack. His third and final. He was buried in Stonewall, beneath a sky he always claimed to understand better than Washington. LBJ was many things: a bully, a visionary, a Southern populist, a civil rights crusader, a war president, a builder, a destroyer. He died before the country could make up its mind. But if Johnson was undone by war, the next to die was undone by peace and paranoia. Richard Nixon had already resigned in disgrace, but death came slowly and public judgment came even slower. Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon didn't die in office. He died in New York in a hospital bed, with the TV turned off and the volume of history finally fading beneath the hum of a heart monitor. But by the time he died on April 22nd, 1994, at the age of 81, Nixon had already pulled off something extraordinary. He survived himself. He was the only president to resign, the only one whose name became shorthand for abuse of power, and the only one who managed somehow to claw his way back into the fringes of political relevance. It took decades, and it nearly killed him more than once. Nixon had been many things: congressman, senator, Eisenhower's vice president, staunch anti-communist, presidential loser, comeback king, elected president in 1968, and re-elected in a 49-state landslide in 1972. He was the architect of détente with the Soviet Union, the opener of relations with China, the ender of the Vietnam War, eventually, and a master of foreign policy chess. And then Watergate. What began as a clumsy break-in at the Democratic National Committee spiraled into one of the greatest political scandals in American history. Wiretaps, cover-ups, enemies lists, tapes. Always the tapes. By August 1974, facing impeachment and political annihilation, Nixon resigned. Gerald Ford pardoned him a month later. Nixon went to California, and for a long time that seemed like the end. But Nixon didn't do endings, he did rewrites. Throughout the 1980s and early 90s, he reemerged as an elder statesman. Presidents consulted him on foreign affairs. He wrote best-selling books, gave speeches, appeared on television. Never quite apologized, but never denied either. A man without illusions, except maybe the one that he could outlive his own erasure. In 1993, his wife, Pat Nixon, died. It shattered him. The following year, Nixon suffered a severe stroke while preparing to eat dinner at home in Park Ridge, New Jersey. He was taken to New York Hospital but never recovered. He died 4 days later, on April 22, 1994. Cause of death, stroke, followed by swelling of the brain and heart failure. He was given a large funeral in Yorba Linda, California, where he was buried beside Pat, eulogized by 4 presidents: Ford, Carter, Reagan, and Clinton. A final stage, finally his. Even in death, Nixon remained a paradox: brilliant and damaged, strategic and self-destructive, visionary and paranoid. The man who always felt hated and then gave the country a reason to hate him. But the next president to die was different. Ronald Reagan didn't leave office in scandal. He left in triumph. And then, slowly, painfully, forgot everything, including the triumph. Ronald Reagan's death didn't come suddenly. It came inch by inch, over the course of a decade, like a curtain closing in slow motion, while the audience sat in silence, already knowing how the story ends. He died on June 5th, 2004, at the age of 93, after a 10-year descent into Alzheimer's disease. By the time his body gave out, his mind had long since left the stage. But once, Reagan had owned the spotlight. He was the 40th president of the United States, the great communicator, the former Hollywood actor who turned governor, then president, then near myth. He won the Cold War, depending on who you ask. Survived an assassination attempt, took on the Soviet Union with charm and missiles, told America it was morning again, and left office with approval ratings most politicians would sell their souls for. He made conservatism charming, deregulation fashionable, and patriotism theatrical. And then he left Washington and faded into the hills of Bel Air, California. In 1994, 5 years after leaving office, Reagan released a handwritten letter to the American public. In it, he announced he had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. "I now begin the journey that will lead me into the sunset of my life," he wrote. And then the silence deepened. For the next 10 years, Reagan disappeared from public life. His wife, Nancy, became his protector and gatekeeper, tending to him as his memory dissolved. The man who once made America feel seen could no longer recognize his own reflection. Former staffers visited and left in tears. Sometimes he smiled. Sometimes he stared. Most days he didn't speak at all. He eventually stopped walking, then stopped swallowing. Then on June 5th, 2004, he stopped breathing. Cause of death, pneumonia, brought on by complications of Alzheimer's disease. His death marked the end of a very American idea of strength with a wink, of optimism at scale, of the presidency as stagecraft with sincerity. The country mourned deeply, if not universally. His state funeral was grand, sweeping, elegiac. Thousands filed past his casket in the Capitol Rotunda. His motorcade moved down Constitution Avenue. He was buried at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library in Simi Valley, California, overlooking the valley at sunset. "We will always remember," they said, but he wouldn't have. Reagan's death wasn't tragic in the usual way. It was gradual, dignified, and terrifying, because it asked what happens when even memory becomes mortal. But while Reagan forgot, the next man to die never lost a detail. Gerald Ford lived long, remembered everything, and became the accidental president who ended up outliving them all. Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford was never supposed to be president. He didn't run for it, didn't campaign for it, didn't even particularly want it. He got the job because everyone else in line either resigned or got indicted. And then somehow, he outlived them all. When Ford died on December 26, 2006, at the age of 93, he became the longest-lived U.S. president in history at the time, a distinction that fit the man perfectly. Quiet, enduring, underestimated, and always slightly off stage. Ford had been a congressman from Michigan for 25 years before Nixon tapped him to replace Spiro Agnew as vice president in 1973. Less than a year later, Nixon resigned, and Ford became the 38th president of the United States. His first words as president were pure Midwestern decency. "Our long national nightmare is over." And for a while, people believed him. He pardoned Nixon, instantly controversial, possibly politically suicidal, definitely historically necessary. His approval ratings tanked, but Ford never flinched. He insisted it was for the country, not for Nixon. Decades later, historians began to agree. He survived 2 assassination attempts, battled stagflation, waged war against inflation with win buttons, lost the 1976 election to Jimmy Carter by the narrowest of margins, and then he bowed out of public life like a man happy to have his evenings back. After the presidency, Ford did what most presidents don't. He actually retired. No desperate legacy tours, no reinvention. He gave speeches, served on corporate boards, played golf, and stayed mostly out of the spotlight. He was a regular fixture on the presidential funeral circuit, outliving Nixon, Reagan, and the entire scandal that made him president in the first place. In late 2006, Ford's health deteriorated. He battled pneumonia and heart disease. He died in Rancho Mirage, California, the day after Christmas. Cause of death, cardiovascular disease, with pneumonia as a contributing factor. He was 93 years and 165 days old, a record at the time for any U.S. president. His state funeral was respectful, reserved, and appropriately Fordian. He lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda, was eulogized in Washington and Grand Rapids, and finally buried on the grounds of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Museum in Michigan. Ford's legacy grew quietly in the years after his death, not for charisma, not for grand vision, but for decency, for stability, for doing the most unpopular thing possible and turning out to be right. But if Gerald Ford was the accidental president who outlasted history, George H.W. Bush was the careful architect of it, a World War II pilot, a diplomat, a spy master, a one-term president who saw the Cold War end on his watch, then slipped away with the kind of grace most men never master. George H.W. Bush, George Herbert Walker. Bush didn't just die at the end of a century, he died at the end of an era. On November 30th, 2018, at the age of 94, the 41st President of the United States passed away in Houston, Texas. He was the longest living president at the time, the last president to have served in World War II, and perhaps the final embodiment of a certain type of American statesman. Modest, patrician, diplomatic, and, by today's standards, almost quaint. Bush's resume read like a government directory. Navy pilot at 18, Yale graduate, congressman, ambassador to the UN envoy to China, director of the CIA, vice president under Reagan, president of the United States. He'd seen everything, up close. When he was elected in 1988, he was the establishment's establishment. And yet, he presided over one of the most radical global transformations in modern history. The Berlin Wall fell, the Soviet Union collapsed, the Cold War ended. Not with a bang, but with Bush's calm hand on the tiller. He led a coalition against Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in the Gulf War, winning a lightning-fast military victory and resisting the urge to occupy Baghdad. Domestically, he broke his infamous "read my lips" promise on taxes and paid the political price for it. In 1992, he lost re-election to a young upstart from Arkansas, but history would revise him upward. After leaving office, Bush faded graciously. He became close friends with his former rival Bill Clinton. He skydived in his 80s. He became a symbol of pre-partisan dignity, of personal grace in public life. When his son, George W. Bush, became the 43rd president, I.W. never tried to dominate the spotlight. In 2012, he was diagnosed with vascular Parkinsonism, a condition that slowly eroded his mobility but not his mind. He watched his wife, Barbara Bush, die in April 2018, and just 7 months later, he followed her. He died surrounded by family. His final words, reportedly spoken to his son George on the phone, were, "I love you too." Cause of death: complications from Parkinson's disease, coupled with age-related decline. His funeral was a national moment. He lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda. Presidents and rivals gathered. His casket was flown to Texas on a plane renamed His Special Air Mission 41. He was buried at the George H.W. Bush Presidential Library in College Station, next to Barbara and their daughter Robin, who had died of leukemia at age 3. He was, in every way, a relic of bipartisanship, diplomacy, quiet strength, and when he died, it felt like the end of something much bigger than a single life. But the last man left, the only one still standing, would live to be 100. Jimmy Carter watched the 20th century end, watched the 21st stumble forward, and held on through wars, cancer, and the funerals of every other president before him. Jimmy Carter didn't just live long, he outlasted history. When he died on December 29th, 2024, at the age of 100, he was no longer just a former president. He was the last living thread to a vanished political world where decency still tried to compete with ambition, and moral clarity could still cost you an election. He had been president for just 4 years, but he spent the next 40 becoming something far rarer, respected. Carter was elected in 1976, a small-town peanut farmer and former governor of Georgia, who ran not on power, but principle. After Watergate, that worked for a while. In office, he pushed for human rights abroad, brokered the Camp David Accords between Egypt and Israel, created the Department of Energy, and tried to shift America off oil. He also inherited stagflation, gas lines, and the Iran hostage crisis. He was methodical when the public wanted charisma, thoughtful when the public wanted action. He lost to Ronald Reagan in 1980 in a landslide, and then something extraordinary happened. Carter didn't disappear. He got to work. He founded the Carter Center, monitored elections across the globe, helped eradicate diseases, built houses with Habitat for Humanity, won the Nobel Peace Prize, survived brain cancer, fell down, got up, and kept building. He taught Sunday school well into his 90s. For nearly half a century after leaving the White House, Jimmy Carter quietly modeled a presidency redeemed by everything that came after. By 2023, he was in hospice care, choosing comfort over intervention. The nation held its breath for a year. Carter turned 99, then 100. He made it to the triple digits with quiet stubbornness and the occasional scoop of ice cream. On December 29th, 2024, at home in Plains, Georgia, with his family around him, he slipped away. His son said he died at 3:45 p.m. in peace. Cause of death: natural causes, compounded by cancer, age, and time finally catching up. The tributes poured in from across the political spectrum and around the world. Flags were lowered. Eulogies were delivered. His casket was carried through his boyhood home, his church, his library. A military flyover saluted his Navy service. He was buried in Plains next to his wife Rosalind. His funeral was not a spectacle. It was a closing chapter, a thank you note, an American pause. Carter had once said, "I have one life and one chance to make it count for something." And he did. He left no scandal, no enemies list, no fortune, just a quiet argument that power and humility don't have to be opposites.